The leadership of the US Armed Forces relied on the experience of past wars, betting on brute force. A plan called Search and Destroy was developed for the Vietnam War, but the Vietnamese refused to follow these rules. They waged war with cunning and stealth, turning invisibility into their main weapon. The resistance forces, using a network of tunnels established in southern Vietnam in the 1950s, significantly expanded it, turning it into a real underground city, stretching 155 miles, 250 kilometers, to the borders with Cambodia. This complex system included secret entrances, living quarters, warehouses, hospitals, and 3 military headquarters. This is where ammunition was stored. The wounded were treated, and even mines were manufactured. Around 80,000 people lived in this underground city, a quarter of whom were partisans. The invisible enemy prepared to strike from deep within the earth, remaining inaccessible to the enemy, who had no idea that the war was literally happening beneath their feet. Stealth and guerrilla tactics were the key methods of opposing US military superiority. Vietnamese partisans used the jungle for camouflage, set ambushes, and attacked at night, never letting the enemy catch their breath. This wore down the opposition's strength and morale. However, the most effective tactics were the traps, which instilled fear due to their brutality. There were so many that every step by the enemy could be their last. Some constructions wounded or slowed the opposition's progress, while others forced them to waste precious time looking for detours. The real nightmare for the enemy were the explosive devices, the most common traps in the rebels' arsenal and, by extension, the greatest fear of American soldiers in the Vietnam War. The explosive traps were simple in design, but deadly effective. Due to a lack of metal, unexploded munitions from carpet bombings, tin cans, and trophy weapons were used to create them. A single explosive trap could not only wound a soldier but also halt the progress of an entire unit, taking 3 people at once out of action: the wounded soldier and 2 comrades trying to evacuate him. One of the most infamous and dangerous of these devices was a mine known as Bouncing Betty, officially called the S-mine, developed by German forces during World War II. The distinctive feature of this mine was its detonation mechanism. When someone would step on it, the pressure launched the mine to a height of 1.6 to 5 feet, where it exploded. Shrapnel flew at speeds of up to 1,000 meters per second, affecting everything within a 65-foot. Anyone near the soldier who was unlucky enough to step on it was wounded. Bouncing Betty pushed soldiers into constant paranoia. No American or Australian patrol could feel safe. The Viet Cong mined paths used by patrols, as well as campsites and open areas. It often turned out that when a US unit stopped for the night and set up sentries, they found themselves encircled with mines by morning. Another effective and often deadly trap was the use of fragmentation grenades hung on trees, with wires or fishing lines attached to branches. This primitive and easy-to-set-up trap caused significant casualties for the enemy. Detecting a tripwire among the dense vegetation of the Vietnamese jungle was a difficult task. Slightless movement of a branch triggered the detonator, causing the grenade to explode while still attached to the tree, amplifying its destructive power. The Viet Cong managed to turn every careless step of the enemy into a threat of death or serious injury. In 1965, about 70% of US Marine Corps casualties were caused by explosive traps, severely undermining the soldiers' morale. But these were not the only dangerous surprises to beware of. It is hard to imagine that in response to the powerful, well-trained US Army with their advanced weaponry, the Viet Cong deployed ordinary bamboo sticks and camouflaged spikes. Lacking the resources to manufacture high-tech traps, they decided to rely on nature and old-fashioned cunning, and surprisingly, they succeeded. Along the routes American soldiers were to take, members of the resistance would dig small pits and place sharpened bamboo stalks at the bottom. Where possible, sharp metal rods were used, sometimes coated with poison. The pit was then carefully camouflaged with fabric and covered with soil and leaves. This type of trap became known as the punji stick. Thanks to its simplicity and effectiveness, it became quite popular in the Vietnamese arsenal. One careless step would cause the victim's foot to slip into the pit, where it was impaled by sharp spikes. Sometimes the spikes were placed at an angle, preventing the trapped soldier from escaping. The spike platform was often rigged so that when it was stepped on, it would collapse inward, trapping the leg. The spikes on the side of the platform would pierce the shin, causing additional wounds. Extracting a person from a trap like that wasn't easy, at times taking up to an hour, which slowed down the entire military unit's progress. Also, areas with punji sticks often contained Viet Cong soldiers who would initiate an attack on the enemy once one of them fell into the trap, causing others to lose vigilance. Coming across a punji stick generally resulted in injury and evacuation to a medical post, but if the spikes were poisoned, chances of survival were almost non-existent. If there was no poison, the Viet Cong would coat the sharp spike with feces or corpse poison, ensuring serious infection. However, falling into this trap was far safer than encountering its modified versions. The modified pits were large, with rods up to half a meter placed. When a soldier fell in, their entire body was impaled. These traps were often equipped with a rotating 180-degree lid, which returns to a horizontal position for the next victim. A reusable, deadly trap. A simpler and easier to prepare surprise was an ordinary bucket buried in the ground. Inside, fishing hooks were fixed with their sharp edges pointing slightly downward. This way, when a soldier tried to pull their foot out, their wounds would only become deeper. Sometimes the unfortunate victim had to be carried to the hospital with the buckets still attached, as freeing themselves on their own was impossible. But while a foot caught in this devil's bucket could still be treated, the trap known as Vietnamese souvenir left soldiers severely wounded and out of action. In this trap, the foot would fall into a camouflaged pit and be impaled on a spike protruding from the bottom. Pressing down on the spike would pull tight ropes that triggered a mechanism, causing sharp metal rods to extend from the walls. These rods pierced and firmly trapped the boot. Removing them without surgical intervention was impossible. In most cases, the limb could not be saved, and the extracted spike became a grim souvenir, which gave the trap its ominous name. However, even the Vietnamese souvenir was outmatched in brutality and lethal potential by what was possibly the most dangerous trap among the wolf pits, the meat grinder. This trap was a construction that consisted of two parallel iron pipes with sharp spikes welded onto them. When a person fell into the pit, their body weight caused the pipes to rotate, driving the spikes into their flesh and locking them into place. There was no chance of escape or survival. If the threats from below were obvious and made it essential for soldiers to watch their step, the danger from above was a deadly surprise. In the dense jungle, where visibility was poor and vegetation was thick, flying traps proved just as effective as those hidden in the ground. To create the flying death trap, Viet Cong soldiers would suspend a spiked log high up in the tree, attaching it to a rope that extended down to the ground. The end of the rope was connected to a tripwire, a thin wire or fishing line. A soldier who triggered the tripwire would hear branches snapping above them, and within seconds, the spiked log would come hurtling toward them. Sometimes, instead of a log, a massive 40-pound or 18-kilo ball studded with sharp stakes was used. Its trajectory was calculated so that upon impact it would strike the enemy's chest and head. Surviving an unexpected collision was highly unlikely. In even denser jungle areas, a similar trap, known as the trap whip, was used. The making of trap whip involved bending a bamboo trunk, one end of which had a shield attached, covered in nails or sharp spikes. This contraption was linked to a tripwire. When triggered, the tension in the bamboo was released, launching the spiked shield directly at the victim's head. Estimates suggest that the pole and its spikes could reach speeds of up to 100 miles per hour. Like the punji stick traps, these spikes were often coated with poison. A more advanced system involved mounting a crossbow on a bamboo frame loaded with a poisoned arrow. The tripwire was connected to the ground or a branch. When triggered, the wire snapped, releasing the crossbow and launching the venomous arrow at the unsuspecting soldier. If the arrow only wounded them, the poison would finish the job. The Viet Cong widely used poison to maximize harm to their enemies. It was a cheap and effective way to turn ordinary traps into deadly ones. Poison was used everywhere and in some cases even incorporated venomous animals into their defenses. Imagine the horror of a soldier waking up at the campsite to find venomous snakes around them, or finding one in their bag. The Viet Cong would plant venomous creatures around American soldiers, hiding them in campsites or jungle trails, even in wolf pits, as an additional hazard alongside sharp stakes. The most commonly used snake was the bamboo pit viper, also known as the three-step snake, because its venom acted almost instantly. The Viet Cong would plant these snakes anywhere they could, in sacks, hollow bamboo stalks, boxes. Bamboo pit vipers are small and, thanks to their size, they could even be tied to tree branches with fishing lines at head level. This tactic instilled constant fear in soldiers, often leading to panic. Repeated encounters with highly venomous snakes caused significant psychological distress, but the Viet Cong didn't stop there. In addition to snakes, they also planted scorpions and venomous spiders, which were abundant in the jungle. There were also cases where soldiers' camps were bombarded with wasp nests, triggering chaos even among seasoned fighters. In moments of confusion, armed Viet Cong squads could launch surprise attacks on the panicked soldiers. And so, one of the most important lessons American soldiers learned in Vietnam was to watch their step, and to also remain constantly vigilant to avoid stumbling upon deadly insects and snakes. These cunning tactics were the Viet Cong's only way to effectively counter the superior forces of the US Army. The development of these traps began in the first months of the conflict. One of the earliest and most widespread traps used to slow enemy advances was the so-called bamboo cartridge. This trap was set in a hole about 20 inches or 50 centimeters deep. At the bottom, there was a small wooden board with a bamboo stick attached to it. One end of the stick had a nail, while the other held a cartridge. The entire setup was carefully camouflaged with leaves and soil. When a soldier stepped on the bamboo stick, it pushed the cartridge downward, striking the primer against the nail, causing it to fire. The severity of the injury depended on the caliber of the cartridge and the soldier's position, but in most cases it resulted in a foot wound that temporarily immobilized the victim. To avoid their own soldiers falling into these traps, the Vietnamese developed an entire signaling system using strategically placed sticks, leaves, and broken branches. An experienced fighter could not only determine the presence of a trap nearby, but even the specific type. This warning system was especially crucial for abandoned houses, which enemy troops were better off avoiding at all costs. If there were a global competition for the worst hospitality, the Viet Cong would undoubtedly take first place. Entering one of these booby-trapped houses meant, at best, getting wounded, and at worst, never coming out. When opening a door, the first thing a soldier risked encountering was a trap called bambooji. It was a frame made of bamboo or wood with sharp spikes attached to it. The trap was placed directly above the doorway, with the entire structure held in place by a taut rope connected to the door. As soon as the door opened, the rope slackened, causing the bambooji to drop straight down, aiming for the soldier's head. If the person failed to react in time and dodge the contraption, the impact was fatal. But even if the soldiers managed to survive, they couldn't afford to let their guard down, as the Viet Cong's hospitality didn't end there. Another deadly trap for soldiers was food left behind in a house, generously poisoned, of course. It was usually placed in a conspicuous spot, like an unexpected treat that could ultimately cost a life. Touching food was strictly forbidden, but a special caution had to be taken with opaque cans that appeared to contain food. Coming across one could result in the loss of a limb or even death. This was a particularly popular kind of trap. The pin was removed from a grenade, and the grenade was placed inside a can. A tripwire, thin and nearly invisible fishing line was attached to the grenade. If someone accidentally triggered it, the grenade would fall out of the can, the safety lever would be released, and an explosion would follow. Another version of the delayed action grenade trap involved grenades with pins removed, held back from exploding by thin rubber bands securing the safety lever. These grenades were carefully hidden inside abandoned houses, making them nearly impossible to detect. The main idea was to exploit the actions of American soldiers who frequently set houses on fire during their clearing operations. When the fire started, the heat melted the rubber bands holding the safety lever, activating the grenade. The explosion injured those near windows, and if the house had thin wooden walls, it would cause severe damage to anyone nearby. All of these ingenious traps and tricks were a striking example of guerrilla warfare mastery. Their stealth and ability to wage war from the shadows was so impeccable that for a long time American troops remained unaware of an entire underground city beneath their feet, where tens of thousands of civilians and thousands of Viet Cong fighters were hiding. By expanding and reinforcing the underground tunnel network known as the Cu Chi Channels, originally built between 1945 and 1954 during the War for Independence against the French colonists, the Viet Cong created an entire underground world that was meticulously thought out. Inner walls of the tunnels, that were between 35 and 50 feet, that's 10 to 15 meters underground, were coated with clay, so attempts to set the tunnels on fire only strengthened their walls. The tunnels were also dug in a way that efforts to flood them would only result in a refreshing shower for the Viet Cong fighters. To counter tear gas and smoke grenades, water-filled pits were placed every 330 feet, 100 meters inside the tunnels. By 1967, the total length of the tunnels reached approximately 155 miles. This underground city was not only a storage site for ammunition, but also a refuge for the wounded, a location of 3 resistance headquarters, a place for trap making and escape routes, and even mine production facilities. According to various estimates, around 80,000 people lived in the tunnels, a quarter of whom were guerrilla fighters. Once the truth about the tunnels was uncovered, intense battles ensued. The US military resorted to bombings and toxic chemical sprays and sent in guard dogs who often returned injured. They even assembled a specialized unit known as tunnel rats, small-statured soldiers who could navigate the cramped tunnels more easily. Yet the Viet Cong did not cease their resistance. They ambushed their enemies, continued setting traps, and occasionally managed to capture prisoners. One particularly effective trap involved hidden nets camouflaged with dirt and leaves. If a soldier let their guard down and stepped on one, they would be instantly snared and hoisted into the air. Escape was possible in only 2 cases: if the soldier had a knife to cut the net, or if his comrades were nearby to help free him. Otherwise, the soldier would be left hanging in midair, waiting for the Viet Cong to arrive and take him prisoner. Which of these traps used during the Vietnam War seems the most brutal to you? Or do you know of any other cunning traps we didn't have time to mention in this video? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and thank you for watching.